Hello, my name is Carrie Love, and I will be presenting on the article Female Sex Work Within the Rural Immigrant Latino Community in the Southeast United States, an explorative, qualitative, community-based participatory research study. This article was published in Progress in Community Health Partnerships in winter 2012. I chose this particular paper because I have an interest in women's health, and I have worked mainly with the female population at domestic violence shelters and rape crisis centers. I also have a background in working with victims of human trafficking, and specifically sex trafficking, which this article touches on. Overall, I felt it was a good research paper, although somewhat limited in its aims and study sample. This project focuses on female sex workers within the immigrant Latino community in North Carolina and looks at the feasibility of a larger study of sex work within the community. As stated by the authors, Latinos in the United States are disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS, and in the southeastern states have notably high infection rates for HIV and STDs. Despite high rates of use of female sex work within the immigrant Latino community, there is a gap in research on sex work within the Southeast where the population is growing. Existing research on sex work among the Latino population includes a paper on sex work among Latino day laborers in Maryland, which found that Latino day laborers with more stress and without a partner in the United States, as well as binge strikers, were more likely to hire a sex worker. Another study on sex work among Latinos in North Carolina found that single men and married men living apart from their spouses were more likely to hire sex workers. However, neither study focused on the sex workers themselves. Some background information on sex work. According to WHO, female sex workers are 13.5% more likely to be living with HIV than other women of the reproductive age. Some reasons why sex workers may be more vulnerable to HIV include having a high number of sex partners, the inability to negotiate condom usage, stigma and shame surrounding sex work, and unsafe working conditions. Unfortunately, there are limited studies on HIV among sex workers, according to the CDC, and sex workers may not know their HIV status or be reluctant to seek care due to a lack of education on sexual health or due to the stigma and criminalization of sex work. The objective of the study is to explore female sex work in order to determine if a larger study of sex work within the immigrant Latino community in North Carolina is feasible. In addition, researchers hope to fill the gap in research on the use of sex workers by immigrant Latino men. There are some barriers in looking at this public health problem. First, there are potential human rights issues. Oftentimes, sex work is not by choice, and people, especially women and girls, are trafficked into prostitution. The Office on Trafficking in Persons defines sex trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. There were concerns prior to starting the study due to the author's limitations in addressing these human rights issues and the potential needs of the participants. However, the authors did move forward with the study in an effort to gain better insight on how they could provide help in the future. Another issue was the stigma surrounding sex work, as sex workers or clients of sex workers could be reluctant to participate in the study. Furthermore, sex workers and clients could be reluctant to participate due to trust. There may be fear of working with researchers or academics due to the criminalization of sex work or because of not having legal status in the United States. The CBPR team included local Latino community members, public health departments, community-based organizations, and universities. The partnership's principles included utilizing partner strengths, transitioning findings into action, and delivering those findings to the community, policymakers, and researchers. However, despite this partnership, the authors note that they were lacking data on the structure and context of sex work, as well as risk behaviors and approaches to intervene from the insider point of view of sex workers. Participants included three groups: immigrant Latino women who sold sex for money to men of any ethnicity or race, women of any ethnicity or race who sold sex to money to Latino men, and immigrant Latino men who hired sex workers with money within the past 6 months. Those selected were from 3 rural counties in North Carolina that had a high percentage of Latinos and Latino growth rates. Snowball sampling was used so that partnership members suggested one person within each of the 3 groups. Interviews were 90 to 150 minutes long, and at the end of each interview, participants recommended other potential participants for the study. The authors used snowball sampling due to the sensitive and private nature of the interview topic. The researchers chose abbreviated life story interviews as the method, as some Latinos value interpersonal engagement. The CBPR partners recommended this approach so that there was a higher chance the participants would engage in the process. The partners created an interview guide with in-depth questions on the participants' experiences with sex work, sexual behavior, services, and more. Interviewers consisted of 3 partnership members, a native Spanish-speaking man and woman, and non-Spanish-speaking woman. Professional transcriptionists, who were native speakers for each of the Spanish and English interviews, transcribed the interviews. Constant comparison and open coding were then used to identify qualitative themes in 4 domains. 4 coders, a female and male Latino community member, a community-based organization representative, and an academic researcher coded the interviews. Of the 14 eligible participants, 12 agreed to enroll. Qualitative themes were organized into 4 domains: structure of sex work, motivation to sell sex, client motivation to hire sex workers, and sexual health-related issues. Regarding the structure of sex work, researchers found that there are a variety of referral sources for clients to find sex workers, including telephone numbers and taxi drivers, controllers, otherwise known as pimps, protect sex workers for drunk or violent clients. Sex workers in bars tend to get to know the client before having sex, and both sex workers and controllers are afraid of the police and immigration services. Motivations to sell sex, as identified by the research, include limited economic options for sex workers and the need for money for drugs. The research identified client motivation to hire sex workers as a lack of social options in rural communities, loneliness, and need to prove masculinity, and the availability of sex workers. Finally, sexual health-related themes included a limited understanding of reproductive and sexual health and available services, clients not wanting to use condoms, high use of alcohol among certain clients, and drug use being uncommon among clients. The authors concluded with several recommendations. First, due to the unmet sexual health-related needs, there is an opportunity to provide education on reproductive and sexual health, as well as to raise awareness of services. Additionally, looking at methods to increase job opportunities and English language skills could help provide other options for work for sex workers. Finally, clients of sex workers could benefit from social opportunities that would provide them with alternatives to using sex work to cope with loneliness. Overall, I found the research paper interesting but lacking in some areas of quality. First, there was a very small sample size with only 12 participants. This gives a limited perspective that may not be generalizable to the entire population. Also, as the authors noted, the participants were limited to Latino immigrants from Mexico, and there were not any non-Latino men included in the study. My largest issue with the paper was that it did not cover how sex trafficking played a role with both the sex workers and the clients. It is certainly true that some sex workers choose their occupation freely, but many sex workers do not have autonomy and are being controlled and oftentimes physically and sexually abused. As the authors note, rates of sex trafficking are high in the Southeast, and the participants may not be able to fully be honest about their experiences out of fear of repercussion. I would also worry that some of the sex workers approached to participate could have been put at further risk of abuse if their controllers or pimps were aware that they spoke to someone about their work. It's clear future research is needed due to the small sample size and very broad scope of this paper. There is also a serious need to plan the next steps. I worry that although there were interesting findings that led to recommendations for interventions, no concrete steps were put in place, leaving both the sex workers and the clients with no true benefits from the participation. As stated earlier in the presentation, there are clear principles outlined in the paper, including building on partner strengths, moving findings into action, and disseminating findings among all. However, it is unclear how all of these principles, especially dissemination and moving findings into action, were actually played out through the paper. There were no true measurable outcomes as the paper was more explorative in nature, aiming to analyze feasibility of a larger study. One strength is that there was a diverse CBPR team, and there were clear roles for certain members of the teams, specifically the interviewers and the transcribers. However, I was concerned that there were no sex workers or former sex workers on the team prior to the start of the study, as they would have had a better understanding of the culture of sex work and how to address sensitive topics, although the study did allow partnership to eventually add these members. One weakness is that it was unclear how the team communicated. While the authors note the partnership has been in effect for years, there is no conversation on how they share credit for accomplishments, build upon their strengths, look at areas for improvement, or provide other feedback. Another weakness is that there is a vagueness concerning future steps for the partnership. While the authors note a need for subsequent studies and a long-term goal of reducing risks within the Latino community, they do not have a concrete plan in place. It is noted that is there a grant proposal in the works to continue to build on the study's findings, and until then, there are no planned interventions. I worry this leaves the participants of the study with little benefits. While they opened up about their needs and barriers, they were left without next steps or increased access to services. The next steps to take from this paper include using a much larger and more diverse sample in another study, and then using those results to form solid interventions with plans in place. As the authors note, action is the hallmark of CBPR, so there is a need for solid research to plan the interventions that were suggested within the paper. In conclusion, the life interviews led to interesting and broad qualitative findings. However, because of the small sample size, the study is not generalizable to the larger population of Latino sex workers and clients. Instead, the findings simply give a small picture of these particular participants' experiences. The authors may have found alternative or expanded conclusions based on the life interview questions used. As the authors note, I believe additional studies are both warranted and needed. My 3 discussion questions are: 1. Do you think that human trafficking should have been addressed more thoroughly in this paper? If so, how do you think the authors could have better addressed the issue? 2. Were any important topics or questions missing from the abbreviated life interview template? If so, what were they? And 3. What do you think could be a possible intervention to help remove some of the stigma from sex work? Or do you believe that attempting to remove the stigma from sex work would not be helpful, and why? This marks the conclusion of my presentation, and you can find my references here.